Welcome to Slow News Day Live. My name is Steve Poikinen. I'm here in lockdown Boulder Creek, California, and I'm very pleased to welcome to the show for the first time a guy who I've been following now for a few years. I think his voice is one of the more important that we could be listening to right now. So I'm excited to have him on. Ladies and gentlemen, Danny+Sjursen, how are you this morning or afternoon, whatever the case may be?
I'm doing great. I'm glad to be here. Crazy times. I'm locked down here in Lawrence, Kansas, sort of the hipster, modestly progressive oasis of the Midwest. And it's an interesting time. And if there's not a lot to talk about.
I have had some incredible experiences in Lawrence, Kansas. Shout out to that place. I went on a William S. Burroughs pilgrimage.
Right.
While I was in the middle of retracing the route that Kerouac took in On the Road. I went up to Lowell, Massachusetts. I hitchhiked down to Raleigh, and then I hopped trains like all the way across, and made sure that I got off the train right outside of Lawrence so I could hang out there for a little bit and kind of experience that. Then later I did Renaissance festivals for a living. I had a number of friends who were from the Lawrence area. So when the Kansas show went down, we would go and we would hang out there as well. Yeah, I've always had a good time there, for sure.
Yeah, definitely an interesting town. We just passed the Kent State shooting 50th anniversary. And as much as I love Lawrence, and I always will, there's been a fall from grace, across these university towns. For example, in January, I led a rally or keynoted a rally about the murder of Soleimani, the assassination and stopping war with Iran and its tracks. And we had about 30 or 40 people come. And we were out on the street, and I had a bullhorn, old school style. We had about 8 students show up out of 30,000. And the reason I say fall from grace is 50 years ago, this town rioted so much so over Kent State and the Vietnam War, so much so that the National Guard came in. They put the entire place, not just the campus, on a 3-day lockdown. And there were shootings in the streets. I mean, between the Guard and a whole bunch of different elements. There was Black Panthers here. So there was this like great rich history. And then I got 8 students who show up, and I was like, man, what a nightmare that is. And there's like a whole bunch of reasons that we could talk about, but it was just a fascinating sort of bookend to this history of this town.
So according to Cynthia McKinney, who I do recognize as a scholar, at least on this subject, the university system, and Ray McGovern corroborates it too when he talks about the Mickey map, the university system has become kind of the new home for COINTELPRO, and has become kind of a clearinghouse for performative woke, but completely removed from any sort of on the ground reality style progressivism or liberalism.
I definitely have noted that. I mean, of course, there's a long history that continues of the university military industrial complex link, right, in terms of research, especially in the sciences and the engineering side. But, even on the liberal arts side, like to give you an example, so I had 8 students at this rally for probably one of the most profound things the empire has done in a while, recently at least, the assassination of one of the most important leaders of a foreign country, a uniformed leader. But when I was in grad school, I did go to the University of Kansas just prior to teaching at West Point. And one of the things I noted was, if that same rally had been held about, say, trans rights or any number of identity politics things, all of which I'm for, the crowd would have been huge. And it seems to me that what's been going on in these universities is they are left alone to, perform progressivism, as I call it, through what seemed to me the most important factor was sidewalk chalk, about, again, gay rights or minority rights. And it's like that kind of identity politics through like this minuscule activity, not that it's wrong, of like sidewalk chalking graffiti everywhere, but all class elements and empire opposition has like mostly been pulled out. So long as the students focus on that performative progressivism. And so long as the professors stay within their ivory tower, and even if they do write relatively radical things, so long as they only write them in like scholastic books that only each other read, that don't reach into the public, then they're allowed to like perform. But, you know, the universities have really fallen from grace for the most part, with some exceptions, from leading any sort of movement. And that's sad. And I think is indicative of the way the system of discipline works, in a way more Huxley than Orwell, you know, sort of opium to the people, and, you know, provide all the gadgets and then sort of control in that way indirectly. And of course, Foucault is rolling in his grave and saying, "I told you so."
Yeah, no, and you're absolutely right. And you had mentioned on the Free Assange vigil the other week, you brought up that we're more Huxley than Orwell, and I've been thinking a lot about that. Not because I was okay, so I gotta explain this, man. All of these live streams, they take place in like a near blackout for me. And if you were to ask me 10 minutes after a show what I said, I have no fucking idea. I had no clue.
Right.
But I do, for the purposes of writing down timestamps and stuff like that, go back and listen after the fact. Now, I used to never listen to anything that I did. Now I do, because I think that you know, people's attention span demands clips more so than 2-hour shows, which is a shame to me. But you had made that comment, and I started thinking about it, and I was like, you know, we really have beaten Orwell to death so much so that it's almost like it has either no meaning or significantly less meaning. But what Huxley was trying to put into our brains is that there's an element of, at least in my opinion, there's an element of personal control that we have that's kind of eliminated from Orwell's writings. And Huxley presents you with a choice. Orwell presents you with a scenario that you either accept as reality or you don't, but that's it. Maybe I'm wrong about that. I don't know.
No, I think you're really onto something. What's interesting is they had a correspondence after Orwell published 1984, which of course comes after. Mm-hmm. And Huxley essentially says in the letter, he says, you know, I like this book, 1984, and I think that you're onto something, but I still think I was right, essentially. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. You know, I think that the outcomes are Orwellian in many cases, and the means sort of are Huxley. And what I'm saying there is, I think that what we're seeing is a population that is distracted by technology and a number of other things. And also, like I said, some of that performative progressive politics, which is important, but when it becomes everything, totally problematic. And so you have a population that is almost acquiescing to or even choosing the discipline and control, right? So whether it's out of desperation in the case of workers who've agreed to, you know, have their cell phones monitored for their every action to see exactly how many breaks they're taking in the factory, you know, for 30 cents extra an hour. So that's the desperation side. Or, you know, they just kind of give into it because they're scared of Corona or whatever. And so, or they really like it when Amazon knows and you know, Siri knows what they want to order next. So we sort of give up this freedom and this privacy willingly. And I think that's the Huxley aspect to it at a certain extent.
Yeah, and cessation of autonomy ultimately is a personal choice. Ultimately, no matter what's being thrown at you. And I think that you're kind of an example of that. I think anyone who's an anti-war veteran is an example of that, because the idea is you join an institution because you want to be part of something larger than yourself. And the sense of self that you give up in basic so that you can become a cohesive unit is either something that you do completely or you do just enough to pass muster, I think.
Absolutely. You know, the anti-war vet community is used to be very, very strong. Vietnam Veterans Against the War was profound. GI resistance in Vietnam was profound. We've actually erased the history of the large extent to which GI resistance, refusing to patrol or even fragging their officers, played a role, not the only role, but played a role in ending that war. Then it went dormant. for a long time. And part of the reason for that was the all-volunteer force was designed to eliminate some of that GI resistance, because if you're not a draftee and you volunteered, the idea was, A, you'd be more inclined to the militarism in the first place because you chose it, and B, even if you were more economic drafted, right, volunteer for economic reasons like most enlisted folks, you would have trouble articulating an anti-war position because people would be able to say, and they often do to me still, although less than they used to, well, you're a volunteer, you chose this, you can't complain. However, after 20 years of war, sort of the inadequacies and the weaknesses of that all-volunteer force have been exposed. And you have many soldiers who are just like, what the heck did I just do? Talk about that blackout factor. I think of like Will Ferrell in Old School, when he does the debate and he's memorized that whole line and then he goes, oh, what just happened? I blacked out. I sort of feel like that about my 18 years in the military world. It's like I came out of it and I was like, what just happened? Like, what was I just a part of, And there's more of us kind of stepping forward. So whereas we're nowhere near the numbers or the influence yet of the Vietnam veterans against the war, you're starting to see it. And an important factor, and I'm the historian geek, is that there's a longer history, even than Vietnam, of GI resistance, either in the uniform or especially upon retirement. And of course, the best example is Marine Corps Major General Smedley Butler, right? Who's the ultimate banana warrior, right? Fights all across South America and Central America, and then he like retires and gives or even before he retires, he gives a phenomenal anti-war speech, one of the most famous of all time, where he says he was a gangster for capitalism and a high-class muscle man for Wall Street. So profound was this speech that it kind of hurts any progression that he had left in his career, probably keeps him from becoming the commandant of the Marine Corps, despite his seniority and the fact that he had won 2 medals of honor, which only maybe 24 people have ever done. And he actually draws the ire of President Hoover. I mean, he gets on the radar of a president. So anti-war vets aren't going to run this movement ourselves, and we certainly can't have the self-righteousness that many soldiers inherently have. We all have it. But however, because the American people trust us, for good or bad, mostly bad, people like Smedley Butler, people like those Vietnam veterans, people like us, do have the opportunity or the possibility of maybe influencing folks who wouldn't otherwise listen. So if that's our small role, that's something.
No, and you're right. And Smedley Butler is a fascinating character in that they tried to hand him the presidency at one point. They tried to get him involved in a coup against FDR.
Correct.
And he was like, you must not have paid attention. I'm not that guy, And that's
in a moment that's not very different from this one, right in the midst of the Great Depression, when there was a lot of talk of we're going to either go communist or we're going to go fascist. There was a lot of worry that like FDR wouldn't be able to hold the center. And of course, Smedley Butler exposing the Wall Street bankers coup that they tried to get him to be a part of is really an interesting sort of time capsule of that moment. And I think we're in a similar one to some extent.
I really do. I agree with that. We're about to enter what unelected members of the global predator class are defining for us as the new normal. And this new normal is going to include things like an app on your phone that tells people you've never met whether or not you're sick. And then those people that have no business making a decision over your lives are then going to make a determination about things like whether or not you can travel, whether or not you can go to work, eventually whether or not you get to be a part of society. And we're seeing now where individual state governors have these contact tracing armies now, volunteer armies of either paid or volunteer snitches who are acting as the hall monitors for open spaces, who also, unelected and there's no public comment on this whatsoever, no public period of debate. And these, the open space hall monitors are going to make a determination about you and whether or not you and I are allowed to freely assemble. We just found out that there may be, and I got to check with Jason Burmis on this, and you may know, but what the requirements are for travel going forward. Because September 7th marks the beginning of Julian Assange's extradition hearing, the second round of it. And we're planning massive demonstrations in Washington, D.C. for that. We'd love you and any other anti-war vet that wants to be a part of that, to come be a part of that. But if somebody's going to make me show proof of vaccination before I can fly, like, my ass is going to have to hitchhike.
Yeah. I mean, it's important to remember, and I know you know this, every single new technology and every single new sort of method that has been, devised and justified as being for our health and welfare throughout history. I mean, we're talking before the automobile. Every single time there's been one, it has inevitably been turned against dissidents. Even if that wasn't necessary, I mean, it depends. People argue about whether it was the intent from the start or whether it was opportunism, and I'm not even going to weigh in on that, right? For fear of being dismissed. However, the fact of the matter is that every one of those technologies, every one of those methods that we were told historically was for our health and benefit, was eventually turned on dissidents. So it's very easy for any method to be turned on folks, and anyone can be labeled first, a communist, then a terrorist. Now what are we going to say? A sick person. I mean, it's you turn these things on folks who are dissidents on any level, and then you broad brush them with the enemy idiom of the day, and it's eventually used against you. And I think that people forget that at their peril.
Yeah, and part of that is all of the reinforcing propaganda that makes you want to forget, that makes you want to, celebrate ceding your autonomy as a good thing. We see a lot of 9/11 framing with what's happening with COVID. And I remarked to a couple of people over just the last couple of weeks that, you and I are allowed to criticize nearly every aspect of the Bush administration and say that George Bush and his cabinet were a bunch of thieving, torturing liars, but we're automatically placed into a particular box if we question the official narrative on 9/11. And we're seeing the exact same things take place with COVID, where, Donald Trump lies 8 times before he gets out of bed in the morning. But the one thing that is absolutely true is where and how this virus originated, regardless of what you think about the response that the Trump administration has done. So there's things you can criticize, but as soon as you step outside of that accepted zone of criticism, you're immediately painted in a certain way. And it's one of the more dangerous aspects of how our society is policed, especially on social media and on platforms like YouTube.
Oh, 100%. And Trump, you brought him up. I mean, he's so interesting, but for different reasons, I think, than most people frame him. The personage and the meaning of Trump has also been used as a disciplinary tool. And what I mean is, to question really any structural problem in America, or to critique the opposition, so to speak, the loosely affiliated opposition to Trump, is to wade into waters where you will be called a Trumpster or a Trumpeteer, and that from the liberal, establishment liberal system is like a scarlet letter. And so, for example, this has been a really big problem for me. I wrote an article critical of Biden's foreign policy that published yesterday. And in this article, I refer to Trump as basically, the exact words were existential threat, unfit for office. So there's plenty of terrible things about Trump in there, right? However, the core of the article is looking at the facts of Biden's foreign policy record and explaining to Americans, hey, what you're gambling on with Biden, I'm not even going to take a position on whether you should or you shouldn't, but what I'm telling you is you're gambling on these things. This is what you get when you gamble on Biden. So I thought it was a fairly reasonable argument. My inbox and social media filled up with literally probably a normal month's worth of hate in one morning. And the most common pejoratives, thrown at me were that I think someone called me a Trumpling, which was a new one. I like that version. Or, you're a Russian asset. And I get that a lot, which I find fascinating, largely because, I would say the ratio is 95 to 5%. How often I've attacked Trump over these years and how often I've attacked Biden. I mean, I've made almost a career of attacking a lot of things about the Trump presidency. Not so much him as a person, because I think that's a distraction, but what he represents as a symptom.
Yeah.
And of course, the Russian thing gets thrown in there. But and also, I've been a part of rallies and movements sort of against him in the streets. All of that is forgotten the minute you question the sacred cow of anti-Trumpism, right? The minute you pull off that motive. And so I think, we used to call anybody we didn't like a communist, then we called anybody we didn't like a terrorist. And then in a strange little Rachel Maddow twisted world, anything that we don't like from somebody, whether it be talk about 9/11, talk about COVID, or in my case, talk about establishment, systemic foreign policy, you become a MAGA hat wearer and you're painted with that pejorative. It's very dangerous. This is a very dangerous disciplinary tool.
It is, and it's intentional. I mean, all the sole purpose of hurling, Russian asset as a pejorative, or you're just helping Trump by criticizing the Democratic establishment. Whole purpose of that is to silence any opposition to just one side of the duopolistic coin, and our conversations are so restricted in I guess wider circle or circles that have a much wider audience than, say, Slow News Day. I hear this video's already been demonetized. As soon as I go live, it's demonetized. So we can have whatever conversation we want to have, and we have a little bit more freedom just in the here and now because of how much suppression and censorship the show receives after the fact. And if I wanted to do a different show, I wouldn't be having you on. I would be having some fucking DSA idiot on, and we would be going, Bernie Sanders good, and he's helping Joe Biden. And there would be a clickbaity title, and I would have, 1,000 people in the chat right now for confirmation bias. But that's not those aren't important conversations to me. Those are the conversations that limit further discourse to me. And we were talking before we got going here about what's been happening in Venezuela and why you think it's the most important story that nobody's talking about. And I concur with that. I immediately grabbed my friend Jason Carney, who is policy wonk and total fucking nerd in his own right, and borderline authoritarian communist in his political thinkings. I recoil from authoritarianism in pretty much every shape and form, but I value his opinion, and he's a homie. So we did a show on it. I went looking for coverage about it in the progressive space, in the left spaces. And what I found, you'd mentioned Gray Zone. They, of course, covered it. Real News did a segment on it, but nobody else is touching it. Why do you think that is? And why do you think this is one of the most important things we need to be talking about?
Yeah, the Venezuela thing is huge. And so anybody who's been following my writing knows that I go in sort of these manic phases of what I'm interested in and what I write about, and I had been on a long Africa kick, and I think we're going to talk about that a little later. And then around the time that the Venezuela thing kicked off, I was like, oh man, pause button, I've got to get smart on Central and South America. And of course I already had a decent background in it, but then what I did was for about 2 weeks now, I just stayed up all night reading every single book I could on the subject. In order to frame it and in order to contextualize it in some future columns. There's a temptation, as my column tomorrow night will say, to dismiss this event as farce. Okay, to look at it, it's obvious and true: incompetence, aborted nature, some of the kind of harebrained, schemy, really poor James Bond novel kind of stuff. It's easy to look at that and make that the story, and then dismiss it. And I think the mainstream media, what they've done is what they think is their due diligence. They reported the story, the AP did, all the papers did something on it. But what you will see, I think, is this will disappear. This will be a blip on the media radar, except at places like the gray zone. I think The Intercept will play with it for a while because of the Brazil connection, for all the flaws there. But it's going to disappear. I say in my latest piece that foreboding is better than farce on this. I think that this Venezuela thing is important for two reasons. One, it represents the logical conclusion, the logical outgrowth of American foreign policy in that region for a century. And all of it is important. And in a sense, this event was of a piece with it. And it cannot be understood properly out of context. And the AP and the Washington Post and the New York Times, they report almost none of the relevant backstory, even including the last 10 years that are Venezuela focused, let alone discussing general American imperialism in Latin America. That's the first piece. And then the second piece is, I would argue that the blurred lines in this operation, in this mission, the blurred lines between the public and the private, right, the mercenary and the official, are in some ways a reflection of a new American way of war, which isn't all that new, by the way. It's kind of a back to the future thing. But to very briefly summarize, around the middle of Obama's presidency, okay, I think that in hindsight, people will place the start point, whether accurately or not, with the Libya debacle, the regime change there. Around that time, massive conventional invasion and occupation of places like Iraq and Afghanistan from the Bush years kind of went out of style. Empire didn't go out of style. We didn't take that failure, that debacle that was Iraq and Afghanistan. We didn't take that as a jumping off point to rethink the empire, to restructure our system. No. We just morphed the habits, the style of empire. And so I think that working through proxies, private contractors, which we should always just call mercenaries, okay, because I like plain language, drones, distant, far-flung, abstract methods, as well as the infusion of special forces teams, which look more and more mercenary by the year, largely due to the nature of all volunteer force. So all of that is a lot of verbosity to say, keep an eye on what happened in Venezuela. Number one, for its relevance to how America acts in Latin America more generally and historically, but two, because this method of indirect and sort of plausibly deniable warfare might represent more of what we have already seen and definitely are going to see. And that won't change no matter who wins in November. No,
do you think that this is... I mean, you're right to point to the start of it, or around 2010, 2011. But given Eric Prince's influence in the Trump administration, is that kind of a sign that we're going to have a more hybrid military, where PMCs are the hammer, and then sanctions and things like economic fuckery. Using the IMF, using the World Bank, things of that nature are good. Like, it'll be that, and PMCs and a standing army will only be to, I don't know, for show, I guess is what I want to say. I'm saying it poorly, but I hope you get the general idea of what I'm trying to communicate.
So in the first half of my career, I was in conventional units. I was in, light reconnaissance units, cavalry, but it was still in the conventional force, right? We still belong to the 40-odd infantry brigades in the army, right? That's the hammer, right? That's the conventional force. In the first half of my career, we were doing all the fighting, and the vast majority of the deaths came from the conventional force, more so than like the special forces, right? For a lot of reasons. We had to drive around, and we were more of a target. That has changed And I think that what we're going to see for some time in the foreseeable future is that those like 40 brigades that make up the conventional army are really only going to exist as a symbol and to deter or contain Russia and China. That's how they'll be used. They'll do a lot of training and not a lot of fighting. And what we've seen is that the special operations community, which has grown so much that it's not quite so special anymore, but the special operations community will do most of the fighting along with the aerial, whether it be manned or unmanned aircraft. So we're going to see more of this. But you mentioned Erik Prince, and I think he's really important. You have a sort of dynasty power marriage that happens between the DeVosses and I forget her husband. We have like a financial sort of power marriage there, and also political influence from like the neoliberal, neoconservative variety, and then of course her brother being Erik Prince. Now, Erik Prince should have been discredited, if not jailed, after what Blackwater was responsible for in Iraq. And on a personal, anecdotal level, I can tell you that my loathing for him as a person and his organization Blackwater is in some ways derived from the fact that I was in Baghdad, and Blackwater would drive around that city and in some cases commit war crimes. They were above the law in a way that we weren't. And so in one case, famously, they shot up like a whole square worth of civilians. Well, folks like me who were occupiers, and of course we were doing evil, but folks like me who were responsible for security in a sector, we kind of picked up the pieces, and we felt the anti-Americanism and the rise in the insurgency because, understandably, the Iraqi people didn't make a distinction between white guys who wear body armor that work for Blackwater and white guys who wear body armor and work for the U.S. Army. And so they got to go back to their comfortable bases with great food, and I was living in the city, and so the attacks went through the roof. So I'll always hate him for that. But Prince, instead of being discredited, is a hero in certain right-wing Trumpster circles. And of course, I mean, think about how absurd and yet instructive it is that we read reports a year ago or so that Erik Prince was putting forward to Trump a plan to completely privatize the war in Afghanistan, to turn the war in Afghanistan into a mercenary war. Officially, it already is, but officially make it a mercenary war, essentially put security contractors in to do what we do now. This shows, A, that there's no accountability for people who've been wrong time and again and committed, in many cases, war crimes, but it also tells us that the mercenary flavor of American war making has now reached the zenith where it actually speaks to power in the Oval Office. And this, again, is, I think, foreboding of things to come.
And that's, I mean, really, that thought should horrify not just anti-war people, but people who are pro-military, who come from a military tradition in their families or are married into one. Like it's a complete desecration of the ideal, not necessarily the reality, but the marketing of what the U.S. military is and does. And that on its face should be enough to get a significant number of people calling for the ouster of Erik Prince from circles of power. But we're seeing the opposite because, Danny+Sjursen, we live in a fucking cartoon. We do. And that's not just something that like appears on Slow+News+Day merch when I finally get it. I mean, it's a thought that I've had for a number of years now. You don't go from a president who won a Nobel Peace Prize and then proceeded to start a bunch of new wars to a president in the WWE Hall of Fame without living in a fucking cartoon. You just don't. And we're now to this point to where we've got red rapist versus blue rapist, and then people are arguing on social media over which one is the better of two rapists. And it's, I mean, it's enough to make you want to ignore that conversation altogether just so you can have a different conversation with a skeptical vet about Africom, which I think is what we should get into now. I do want to preface going into our escaladio and our role on the African continent with noting that today is the 35th anniversary of the MOVE bombing in Philadelphia. And if you guys aren't familiar with that, if you're watching the show right now, and you're like, what the fuck did that guy just talk about? So 35 years ago today, there were activists, black activists, living in one house in a Philadelphia neighborhood who were part of a Back to Africa Pan-African movement. And they had a number of charges that were leveled against some of their members. They had some people doing time. I'm going to do a very quick recap of what happened. I've done a number of panels on this, by the way. I'll post them in the show notes. But the fucking Philadelphia police dropped a bomb, an incendiary bomb, on this house and shot men, women, and children as they were trying to escape. Rounded up a handful of them. There's one surviving adult member of MOVE left. Her name is Ramona Africa, and Reverend Annie, who's been on the show a couple of times now, is trying to put me in contact with her so I can have her on this show. But for a brief segment on two white guys talk about the MOVE bombing, let's briefly talk about the MOVE bombing.
Yeah, so the U.S. government has always been terrified of Pan-Africanism and any sort of transnational activism. And that has been the case whether it was white socialists like Eugene Debs, who sort of saw connections with the working classes everywhere, or more recently, especially during the 1960s and forward, sort of, the connections between the Black Panthers and the president of Ghana. And I mean, it's no accident that a lot of the people in the Black liberation movement ended up in Africa, right? Ended up changing their names, like Stokely Carmichael, Kwame Ture, and then kind of, working with these Pan-Africanists and African nationalists there. So this is terrifying. We know about the level of involvement of the FBI and then illegally the CIA, because they're not supposed to work domestically, although they always have, in, just destroying, sabotaging the civil rights movement, especially if it had even an inkling of sort of African nationalist flavor. And that sabotage worked in a number of ways. Some of it was on the overt scale of utter oppression in the case of this bombing in Philadelphia, which is a really profound moment that no one remembers, of course, or, the assassination of Fred Hampton in Chicago. I mean, this is all of a piece with the government's war on Black liberation movements. And, another thing I think that we see in that bombing is an early manifestation of something that's gone totally off the rails today, which is the militarization of the police. In what universe, please tell me in what universe, a local city police department even has the capacity to drop an incendiary bomb, right? Let alone the fact that they did so, who knows under what justification or whose authority. All of that is problematic in and of itself. But in what world do they have the capacity? These are supposed to be community police officers. All the research for hundreds of years, but all the research has shown us that community neighborhood policing is the way to go. They should come from the community. They should be as much disarmed as possible. This is what works, right? Anything else actually breeds crime. And violence and all this oppression. So yeah, I think that that's part of the story. And so the logical conclusion, most things end up going to their logical and thus farcical conclusion. And of course, we talked about Venezuela, which is one example. But here, the farcical conclusion today is Indiana towns with 4,000 people who haven't had a murder since the Kennedy administration, who drive around in MRAPs, right? Military armored vehicles surplus from Iraq. This is where it goes, right? This is where it goes. And so, we're talking about, like 1985. And that was an early manifestation of this moment that we now see with the militarization of police. And I've written a lot of articles about this, one cannot understand the militarization of the police without understanding the history that all empires in history come home. And what you do in the periphery of said empire, to use the scholastic sort of terms, ends up coming home to the metropole, comes to the home front. And it is no accident that so many of these militarized police are peddling their wares through the experiences they gained as occupying soldiers in the US military. So the bombing, to me, and there are so many other places you could take it, but it is a reflection of a longstanding war on Black people, but especially Black liberation or Black nationalist people. And it is a reflection of a militarized society down to the beat cop, who, far from twirling his baton and talking to your grandmother as she sweeps the sidewalk, is now a RoboCop soldier who looks, talks, and carries the wares of the occupation imperial soldier.
You're exactly right in that assessment. And it's something that, like, there's so much reinforcement that this is the way it's supposed to be. And when you talk about like small towns in Indiana getting MRAVs, that hits me personally because I grew up in a relatively small town in Indiana. I managed to escape, as it were, the 25 years ago or whatever. But I come from the town in Indiana that elected Mike Pence to Congress when he was originally as a congressman. And no, that's not my fault. I was already gone. But I do bear no small amount of responsibility for getting the guy who was elected before him, a guy named David McIntosh, who was I think he's at, I don't know, one of the more nefarious think tanks that guy runs now, but he was a former student of my dad's. My dad was a history teacher. And so I did have I had the ability to have a broader understanding of the world that I lived in. I didn't necessarily go explore it until I was almost out of the house. But we're Americans, as a rule, don't know our own history. And we're taught to not go digging into our own history. And in terms of recent history and the coming conflict between the US and China has been underway now really since 2007, when Africom was established.
Right.
Because we've been fighting a war with China that nobody knows about because it's been taking place on the African continent.
I think I'm so glad you brought that year up, the founding of Africom, right? So George Bush, at the end of his second term, announces the founding of the Africa Command, the Pentagon's Africa Command, a joint command. A couple of things that need to be said about that. First, prior to that, Africa was run, all Africa-related military operations were run out of EUCOM, European Command. And its headquarters, by the way, Africom's headquarters, is still not in Africa. It's run from Germany, right? Fascinating and indicative and illustrative. Okay, so I think the fact that Africa was run from European Command is a reflection of the fact that we have traditionally, until recently, deferred, in a sense, to our former European imperialist allies in NATO. And so Africa was seen more as a French and British, and to some extent Portuguese and Belgium sphere. So we were always involved, but in some ways we deferred, especially in West Africa, until recently, where now we've taken the lead even over France, although the French are still there. That's the first point. The second point is the timing. Why 2007? Why 2008? Why take a new interest in Africa then? Well, if you look at trade statistics, until 2008, which I think was the pivot year, and I've written about this, the number one trading partner of Africa was France. And that had been slowly, the gap had been narrowing between France and China over the preceding decade, until in 2008, China became the primary recipient of Africa trade. There is no doubt that Africa is little more than a proxy continent of billions, I should say, than anything else. The American military does not care about Africans. Let us disabuse ourselves of that notion. Every aspect of American foreign policy has shown that Africans are not the issue of Africom. Okay, it was founded in large part as a way to counter Chinese soft power, which isn't completely soft, but Chinese financial power and investment in Africa. It is no accident that 2007, 2008 was the time period. However, what has the United States actually been doing in Africa? Well, we say that we're fighting terrorism. Well, that's fascinating because terrorism has exploded. And every time I say the word terrorism, listeners put it in quotes. But terrorism, as defined by the United States, has been exploded. Terror groups, transnational groups, ethnic insurgencies that usually have very little to do with Islam, all of these have exploded in the outgrowth of Africom. That is largely because history and facts prove that foreign intervention anywhere, but especially in Africa, raises nationalist and anti-American or anti-imperial sentiment. This is the outgrowth. So it's been an utterly counterproductive enterprise. We are losing throughout West Africa, the Sahel, which is sort of our main focus right now, and we can get into that. We are losing. These groups are stronger than ever, that we call our enemies. But in many ways, terrorism, the fight against terrorism, is a convenient canard for what is really, in many ways, a method, a counterproductive and ultimately failing, I promise, method of countering Chinese infusion into Africa. And the coronavirus and the new war scare and the new Cold War can only necessarily have negative outgrowths in Africa for Africans. Because please remember, Africom has nothing to do with the welfare of Africans, and it never has.
And it's one of those things where you're not the only one who's figured out that this is A, not about Africans in general, and B, a completely backwards, counterproductive and losing strategy, which begs the question, why the fuck are we still doing it? Like, it's not like we don't have at least, or close, a little bit over a decade to look back on this and go, okay, well, it was a success, or it was an unsuccessful venture, all along the West African coast. It was an unsuccessful venture, in the interior. What's happened with the Democratic Republic of Congo is almost entirely the U.S.'s fault. So why continue it? Like, is it solely profit motive? Or are we even generating a sustainable income out of there? Is it pride?
Yeah. Historians argue about this, right? And so do political scientists and international relations scholars. Much of the debate, which is worthy, no one knows about because, again, they only write for each other. They write these esoteric books and no one cares. And they're really poor writers, most of them. Smart people, bad writers. However, this is a complex question, and most are. I wish that the following was true, okay? I wish that there were an evil capitalist mastermind, a singular conspiracy, and that this was all about money, that was it. Now, that is a massive factor, but I think it is more complex than that, because if you look at American intervention in, say, the Banana Wars in, sort of early 20th century Central America, if you look at a lot of American interventions historically in Africa, they actually haven't been all that profitable. So certain individual corporations that were protected have earned serious profits, but the statistics don't really back up the notion that it's all about the money. However, perception and pride are really important. There is an irrational aspect, I believe, to the human condition, to human nature. And nations and governments are at root, for all their systemic injustice, they are at root conglomerations of humans, right, with all these flaws and foibles. And so I think a lot of wars and a lot of interventions have been done in the name of pride, national symbolism, dogma that really just is not backed up by the facts. However, the one constant winner is the military-industrial complex more broadly. And even the military-industrial complex is not simple, and it's not a monolith. But here's an example of what I mean. There is a linkage between the perceived economic profits of the defense contractors, because they win no matter what. So long as we are building up to, whether it's to counter Russia or to fight terrorism in lots of brush fire wars, they win. They're the winners, right? But there's a connection between the ideological component, the American exceptionalist ideological component, and the military. And the military-industrial complex economic one. So the best example is Lindsey Graham, anecdotally. Mark Esper, who I am no fan of. I wrote an extensive article about his class at West Point, and they're just nefarious dealings. But Esper talked, even before Corona, he's the Secretary of Defense, he talked about downgrading some troop levels and centralizing certain troop bases in Africa. So this was going to be a modest withdrawal from Africa, not a serious one, not a paradigm shifting one. Lindsey Graham, not long ago, this year, threatened Mark Esper. He said, if you pull out of Africa, I can make your life a living hell. Of course he can, right? Because he's a foreign policy guru. He's got a lot of control. He's always had a big foreign policy portfolio. He's been wrong about everything. Lindsey Graham, senator from South Carolina. But he's got a lot of influence up on the Hill, like his buddy McCain, his old simpatico, did. We have, instead of a Congress that is questioning and challenging imperialism, we have a Congress that in many cases won't even countenance minor withdrawals from the emperor, right? From these, executive branch decisions. Won't even countenance that, and will actually threaten you. So you can show Lindsey Graham, we're failing tactically, we're not getting as much out of it economically as we might like, and he will still say, how dare you pull out of Africa? And I think that is driven by his subservience, of course, to the military-industrial complex, but also this is a true zealot in a lot of ways of American exceptionalism. So I do not think you can understand Africa or any other hyper-interventionism without linking inextricably the sort of metaphysics of exceptionalism with the profit motive of the military-industrial complex. They're almost never discrete.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I agree with that assessment. I think that in Lindsey Graham's case in particular, you see this sort of craven devotion to an idea that has never actually existed, like a reality that's never actually existed. And that's definitely got a lot to do with the mythos of American exceptionalism, but it's also this almost fanatical devotion that Graham has to John McCain and what John McCain's own personal foreign policy aims were, both in Africa and the Middle East. And it's there's like a section on the right that almost believes that John McCain got elected president in 2008, the way that they adhere to the miserably failed doctrines that McCain put forth. And Lindsey Graham is sort of the standard bearer for that. And also, I believe a Navy man. I'm not 100% on that, but I believe he was Navy.
I can't remember if he was Navy or Army, but he was a JAG in the reserves for a very long time. I think he's colonel. I'd have to look, but he is a vaguely military man who's never, of course, seen a shot fired in anger like most of them. But yes, he has a military background, and he is devoted to the cult of the military worship that kind of defines our current era, right? The thank you for your service cult, which is really what it is. McCain is important. And I'm going to say something rather controversial that I truly believe, though. You have to caveat everything you say about someone like McCain in the prevailing discourse of America by saying, oh, he's a hero. Like, so whatever I'm about to say critical of him, somehow I have to preface it with his heroic status. I'm not really going to do that. He suffered dearly in that prisoner of war camp. Okay. And I don't minimize that. But I'm not going to go to the heroic place. There were two types of Vietnam veterans. There were two types of responses to the experience of having fought in Vietnam, to simplify. There was those who, and they were the loudest voice at first. They were those who said, this was an awful war. I saw it. I burned villages. I saw my buddies killed, and I saw what we did to the Vietnamese, and we can never do this again. It was a war crime, and it was a lie. Right? That was one response. And then the other response was, we were winning, and we were stabbed in the back by you hippie protesters and by a weak-kneed Congress. And that's all that's myth, right? The Congress supported the war up until about 1970, which is the tail end of the war. Most of the people had already died. McCain is of the second variety. He's of the we could have won, it was a noble cause, we got stabbed in the back variety. Now, one must be careful when parsing out sort of the psychological motivations of folks. But let's just look at two establishment figures, very establishment figures, both Republicans. Chuck Hagel, who for a time was Obama's Secretary of Defense in a bipartisan-ish fashion, and John McCain. Both of them were in Vietnam. And both of them took very hard stands on the later Iraq War at the height of it when I was there. John McCain was totally pro-Iraq War, totally pro-surge, stay the course, win, impose democracy. Anything less is treason. Chuck Hagel, also a Vietnam veteran, was very critical of the war as a Republican, okay, which was fairly rare at the time. We're seeing more of that with like Thomas Massey in Kentucky and some other libertarian folks, but Hagel was an early critic. And now he didn't really play that out like some of us had hoped once he was in power, but nevertheless, he was very critical of the war. And now I'm speculating, and so we can't take too much from this, but they had very different experiences in Vietnam, didn't they? So Chuck Hagel was an infantryman, an enlisted infantryman whose brother was in the same squad, who I believe was shot in the neck, although he lived, in the bush, okay? So Hagel's Vietnam was visceral. Hagel's Vietnam was a smell and see the outcome of war in its realities, Vietnam. And Hagel takes a number of lessons for that. And the only reason I mention it is because he talks about it, right? So I'm not projecting this completely. He talks about what he learned. So that's Hagel, and he takes a certain position on Iraq. McCain, because he was captured, has been canonized and heroicized. And maybe some of what he did in the camp was that, although, it's complicated. But nevertheless, McCain's war was a different war. McCain's war was a takeoff from a comfortable aircraft carrier, big fancy bases with lots of food, Naval Academy, father was an admiral, bomb folks on the ground who you will never see war. Now, he was shot down, and so, of course, he saw that end of combat in that probably terrifying moment, and then, of course, suffered it as a POW. But these are two very different wars, two very different versions of reality. And so I think, in part, one can speculate that they drew different lessons, and they then applied them to Iraq. Final point on that is that when McCain is shot down, the war is perceived to be going well. It's fairly early in the war. The public is mostly behind said war. And then he's kind of in a blackout, quite literally, until he comes home to this country that suddenly is anti-war. And his response to that was, we got sort of traitors kind of stabbed us in the back, whereas Hagel's in the war, a little later and isn't blacked out and sort of sees the development of it as really a tragedy. So I think that you cannot understand these two folks without that, cannot understand the response of veterans to war without knowing their experience.
And that's something that I think people on the ground kind of know intrinsically, but won't figure it out until they go and they talk to a number of different veterans and people from, who were infantry, volunteer or drafted, doesn't matter. You definitely have a completely different war experience than people who, went straight to officer school right out of high school. And it does, like, it's a defining characteristic of how all of those conversations are going to go. McCain was on his way to commit a war crime when he was shot down. Like, the particular area that was targeted, he had no business flying there in the first place. And I think for a lot of people, that's something that gets dismissed out of hand right away. Like, he had no business being up in the air on his way to where he was on his way to blow it up in the first place. That doesn't mean that he deserved to be tortured. But it also doesn't mean that his behavior coming out of that needed to be so vastly, angrily pro-imperialistic. I tend to think that you're right, that he experienced a good chunk of that war, with zero communication, left, with fanfare, and returned to chaos. I guess it would be one of the simpler ways to describe it. We've been going for a little bit more than an hour now. I was listening to the Fortress+on+a+Hill with Bob Scheer this week, and you guys had a little bit of discussion about cult of personality politicians, and I think that what we're shown, the politicians that are selected for us, that we maybe think are representatives of the people, in terms of like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is certainly not a representative of the people. The reason we're shown cult of personality candidates, the reason we have to choose from cult of personality candidates, is definitely not because that's the best party can come up with, but that's the easiest way to contain the voting electorate.
Yes, I agree completely. First off, there's been a lot of disappointment of late from, the squad, right? The great people of color hope, to substitute for great white hope, the great hope of progressive Democrats, right? The new wave, the new blue wave. On the merits, I support much of what they ran on, but they've let us down in a lot of ways. Maybe on behalf of an attaboy from Mother Nancy, and you even see like Ilhan Omar of all people, right? Sort of like supporting this sort of anti-Iran, just shocking, but maybe not shocking, right? Because it's of a piece with our history. Personality cult politicians. I think one of the tools that it serves is also less Orwellian. Although Trump feels very Orwellian, but like a lot of these folks, even in the opposition, we focus on character and personality at the expense of policy and behavior. And so, if you look at American election, and poll after poll, what do we elect people on? There's always that joke about who would you rather have a beer with, but that is real.
Mm-hmm.
There's real data on this. People, largely because they're paycheck to paycheck and they're busy, folks don't really acquaint themselves with policy, aren't educated in the systemic problems. And so they do sort of pick people based on character. That's why things like gaffes and scandals dominate election cycles, right? More than really issues. And, I think that some of that is by design. The fact that we only know, half a dozen Democratic senators and congressmen by name, famous ones, is a reflection of that. So it's we put these people on a pedestal, either in opposition to Trump or in, support of, and then they become the story. The person becomes the story, and we're allowed to argue about that. And I think that that's really dangerous. And it has not served the people. And of course, the legislature, to close, is supposed to be the people's branch. It is in the legislature, which was supposed to be dominant, right? According to many of the founders, which is already a problematic word, but according to many of the founders and philosophers of the 18th century Enlightenment liberalism, the legislature was supposed to be paramount. So yes, we have co-equal branches, we say, but the legislature was supposed to be all that. But of course, in reality, the people's branch is not very much for the people any longer, and the cult is a symptom and a strategy in that.
Yeah, that's it. It's all marketing. It is the analogy I've been using for a little bit now is if you have a machine and that machine has fundamentally fatal design flaws, and your idea of helping is to change some of the components on that machine, all you're doing is giving it more opportunities to kill you. You're not fixing any of the problems. You're just, you're just slapping a new shiny bit on it and hoping that enough people celebrate a brand new shiny part that nobody notices that you're still trying to operate the same fatally flawed device over and over and over again.
Oh, of course, and then of course we elect criminal perpetrators to solve the crime in many cases. So if the system is designed to create empire, right, and economic and racial disparity, which I think that it is demonstrably from the start, what we do is the party system, it regurgitates figures for national office who are prominent enough and backed enough by the moneyed interests to be viable. That's a key word, and it's a dangerous word, viable candidates. It regurgitates folks that were implicated in the machine and in the crime for decades. And of course, Biden is a perfect example of that, which I think is why so many folks against their interests found Trump so amenable, and why we saw the bizarre, truly bizarre, I know it's talked about a lot, but truly bizarre phenomenon of Obama voters from 12 voting for Trump in 16. I mean, to think that an American could vote for Barack Hussein Obama, whose middle name is the same as the Iraqi dictator we were told was the new Hitler, and whose last name rhymes with the terrorist who we were supposedly at war with and is black or half black, to think that someone could vote for that character with that name and then, of course, 4 years later vote for Trump, I think is indicative of not that Trump is a great white hope because he's a monster, but that so fed up with someone like Biden, for example, or someone like Hillary, who was decisive in these crimes and then put up by the People's Party, right, quote unquote, the Democrats, to solve the crime. It's like, I mean, it would literally be almost as if, and I'm being hyperbolic, you took Ted Bundy and the cops were like, hey, we're going to deputize you. Can you solve these like lady murders? I mean, it's crazy.
Yeah. No, but you're right. And the hyperbole, like, it underscores a point, and it's hyperbole is a rhetorical device when you exaggerate to clarify. But you're not wrong. We've got the guy who wrote the 1994 crime bill and the guy who wrote the pre-runner to the Patriot Act and the omnibus counterterrorism bill. We've got him who helped Barack Obama kind of shepherd in this era of gig economy and forever war and just beyond intrusive surveillance as supposedly the candidate for the people, versus who's in no way, shape, or form a populist. Like Donald Trump is hands down, at least on the campaign trail, much more so of a populist than Joe Biden will ever be. He can't even fake it right. But we're suddenly supposed to have collective national amnesia when we go into, or I guess we won't be going into a voting booth, but when we're marking our mail-in ballots this year. I don't even know if we're going to have a fucking election, to be perfectly honest with you. I don't. And I don't see anyone in Trump's regime leaving because they lost. Well, I flat out know. We've still got Elliott-Abrams in charge of Colombia and Venezuela. We've still got the same PNAC monsters that you might not be hearing their names too much, but Michael Chertoff still exists. Mm-hmm. William McChrystal still exists. But Paul Wolfowitz still exists. John Bolton left the White House and went straight back to his pack. And John Bolton is still helping to shape how we think about foreign policy. You don't get to claim you have a brand new house because you changed some curtains.
Yeah. No, I'm so glad you brought up like a million things I want to talk about, but I'll hold it to 3 points that are going to be brief. First, you mentioned Elliott-Abrams, who is the special assistant to Venezuela for the Trump administration. And so he'll be in a prominent place in my article at the American Conservative tomorrow night. An interesting place for me to write, but actually they've got some good stuff. Elliott-Abrams, of course, is the prime example the most obscene example of assigning or deputizing Jack the Ripper to solve the prostitute murders, because he facilitated war crimes for a living for Reagan and Bush 1 in the very region where he's now supposed to like solve the problem. So he's the best example, right? He's an obscene example, which can be instructive. And then the second point is about like Biden and some of his record. Well, first of all, this is a guy who is riding the Obama coattails in a really just disturbing way, okay? And so first thing I want to say is about Obama, who I once allowed myself to believe in right after Iraq. So turned off by the war was I, and not yet politically sophisticated in the systemic problems, that I really put a lot of hope in him. I was so turned off by my 15 months in that war and everything I had experienced and viewed. I was like, anybody who will get us out, this is a great opportunity. So I was in Southern Indiana, right? I was in your old state, taking my uniform off when I was 2008 and like playing around canvassing and getting yelled at by folks. And I'm almost embarrassed to say that now, but I did. Obama is a Christian, I think. He tells us that a lot. I like the New Testament, even though, none of the people whose names are associated wrote them. But I heard about this part where you're supposed to like sell everything you have and then follow Jesus. Now, obviously, we all have to live. And I have my little apartment and I'm not exactly living it exactly. But, I think he could probably really help a lot of folks out if he sold those mansions in like whatever, Nantucket or Martha's Vineyard. But so that's my first point. But that's just me being petulant. Biden and Black America does not get quite enough attention. I would never deign to critique Black Americans' motives in their voting. I think that it's too complex, and I'm not equipped. But there are some facts, and they are sad. They make me sad for Black Democrats more than angry. Biden begins his career as a friend of segregationists opposing busing. He then passes the crime bill, which was a epic, if not existential, tragedy for young Black America. And of course, all the debt and credit card stuff and loan issues that affected African Americans disproportionately and all this. And then, of course, his response to the housing crisis and kicking people out under Obama, which again disproportionately affected Blacks. And then he, of course, in a more anecdotal way, like lies about getting arrested, trying to see Nelson Mandela. This should be, one would think, and I can't understand the Black experience, and I wouldn't pretend to, but it just seems on the surface that this should be a real insult to them. The record and even that anecdotal part. And then the fact that he's like wildly popular electorally with those who vote, with the small percentage of folks who actually vote, especially Black Americans, is really tragic. And it shows that this is a system running as designed, actually, in a terrifying and disconcerting way.
Yeah, no, you're right. When people say to me, the system's broken, we've got to fix it, my immediate response is no, it's running the way that it was designed to run. It's running as intended. The reason you think it's broken is because it's not working for you, but it wasn't fucking designed for you. It wasn't designed for me. It was designed for a relatively small group of the predator class to be able to not just continue to thrive in their own circles, but to secure that prosperity for their progeny and their progeny alone, and fuck you and fuck you and fuck him. And look, when I talk to the people that I grew up with, because Anderson, Indiana is a very mixed town. And in many, many ways, at least the downtown area of it, as much of a chocolate city as Atlanta, Georgia, or DC for a number of years until we gentrified that. And when I talk to the people that I grew up with, whose parents are pretty much 100% voting for Biden, I'm like, well, why? And they're like, look, do you know how scared of the GOP we are? Do you know that we see Bull Connor's face in Donald Trump every single day? The thought of being victimized further by that political party is so repellent to us. And we know Joe Biden. We know he's a piece of shit, but we're pretty sure he's our piece of shit. And like, that's what they have to say about it. The end all be all. Record be damned. He's walking around wearing Barack Obama like a fucking sweater. And that's enough of a thread of hope in at least the older Black community for them to be like, yeah, look, we know he sucks, but we put Kennedy's picture up on the wall and he wasn't any kind of nice to us either.
No, I mean, I'm actually sympathetic to it.
Yeah.
I try to be really careful about my attacks, or critique is a better word, of the two-party system and people's willingness to support the Democratic candidates, especially people of color, because, you know, the obvious points are like where Trump is a nightmare and potentially existential is his positions on nuclear weapons treaties, and then of course the climate. But, you know, on a more micro but equally profound level, it is easy. I think I'm right, but it is easy for our position, or I can only really speak for mine, to be mischaracterized, but with some reason. I mean, I know why it happens, as like petulant white boy, supposedly like Bernie bros, right? Which is such a terrible brush, but that's what's used. And so what do you know? Like, you can't understand the fear. And I'm actually sympathetic to a certain degree because of what you said. I mean, Trump is a different animal for an undocumented immigrant, a different animal for a person with the experience of segregation and post-segregation, de facto segregation, African Americans. And so I do try to be sympathetic to that. The challenge, of course, in some is to try to politically persuade. I don't want to say educate because of the paternalistic sound of that, but like just kind of like communicate to folks that, you know, nothing is going to change if we keep substituting polite and coarse emperors in rotation, because either way you get an emperor.
Yeah, I agree. I think we'll wrap up on that. Danny, I want to thank you so much for being on the show. Dan, thank you again for coming on the Free Assange Vigil the other week too. That was a fantastic episode. And if you guys are watching right now, you haven't seen it. Danny and Kevin Zeese were on. We had just a killer discussion. So go check that out. Please let everybody know where they can find you and the best or easiest ways to listen to Fortress+on+a+Hill, and keep up with your writing, because you write a lot and it is worth taking the time to read.
Well, I appreciate that, and I was glad to be on. I have a website now. I finally broke down and got someone to do one. It's skepticalvet.com. Everything that I write ends up there. My weekly columns are to Antiwar.com, and then the podcast is really starting to take off. Fortress+on+a+Hill, it's everywhere, right? Stitcher, Apple. Just type Fortress+on+a+Hill in. It's me and a couple of other sort of left-leaning anti-war vets, and we've had great interviews recently. I hope we can have you on soon. Do check it out, and if you want to help out, obviously we're all starving artists, activists, so there's the Patreon aspect that you'll see, but I'm just happy for people to listen and read. And hey, man, thanks again for doing this. I'd be happy to do it again.
Awesome. And that's going to do it for this morning Slow News Day. I will be back at 2 p.m. Pacific, 5 p.m. Eastern with Ryan from The Last American Vagabond. That's going to be a hell of a conversation, so make sure you're there for that. Tomorrow, deep dive into Sunrise Movement with Robbie Yeager, and then Alex from Red Star Radio will be on after that. The one and only Commander X, one of the original anonymous hacktivists, will be on Sunday. He's bringing his attorney, which I think is fucking hysterical, because one, she's an advocate for Julian Assange and is incredibly sharp in her own right, but X is concerned that he may say some incriminating shit. So we'll see what we can't get him to spout out of the side of his neck. That's gonna be fun as hell. Thank you guys for watching so much. I fucking love you. You're the only reason that I have a show in the goddamn first place. So give yourselves some ass and titty smacks for being you.